Welcome to our sleepy exploration of the great battles of history, all from a time before the year 1800. There is no need for armor or shields here. Just find that perfect, cozy spot and let your shoulders relax. Allow your head to feel heavy on the pillow and take a slow, deep breath. Let the day's worries simply fade away. Where are you tuning in from this evening? Or perhaps it's morning in your perfectly managed, not at all chaotic schedule. Whatever the time, you are most welcome here. If you enjoy this quiet escape from the modern world, consider following along so we can meet for more stories. Now, let your mind drift. We travel back to an age of bronze and iron. Forget the grand maps and strategies for a moment. Instead, picture a single scout wrapped in a heavy cloak on a cool hillside. Below, you can see thousands of flickering campfires belonging to an advancing army. His report in the morning will change the world. The journey begins not in a grand throne room or a scholar's library, but on a wide, dry plain in ancient Greece. The first thing one would notice is the sound, a deep, rhythmic pulse of hundreds of leather sandals striking the baked earth in perfect time. It is a sound that grows from a whisper to a steady, powerful beat, the heartbeat of an army on the move. Accompanying it is a low chant, a simple cadence rising from the chests of the men, a sound meant less for the enemy and more for themselves, a way to bind each individual into a single, determined whole. As they draw closer, the sight resolves itself into a long, solid line of gleaming bronze, a wall of overlapping circular shields that catches the light. Above this wall bristles a dense forest of spear points, a thicket of deadly wood and metal moving as one. This formation, the Greek Phalanx, was more than just a block of soldiers. It was a living, breathing creature of war, and its strength came from the men who composed it. Let us place ourselves within that line, standing shoulder to shoulder with our neighbors. The first reality is the weight. On the left arm is the aspis, a large, concave shield made of wood and faced with bronze, weighing nearly 20 pounds. Its unique grip, a central band for the forearm and a rope handle near the rim, distributes this weight, but after hours of marching, the muscles in the arm and shoulder burn with a deep, persistent ache. The man beside you, a potter you have known since childhood, has the edge of his shield protecting your right side, just as yours protects his left. This simple overlapping design is the core of the entire system, a physical representation of the trust placed in one's fellow citizen. From behind the shield's rim, the world becomes a narrow slit. Vision is constrained by the bronze Corinthian helmet, a masterwork of protective gear that covers the entire head and neck. While it could turn aside a sword blow, it also muffled sound and severely limited peripheral sight. A hoplite, as these citizen soldiers were called, could see only what was directly in front of him. He could not easily glance to his left or right to gauge the battle's flow. This design forced a reliance on the men around him and on the shouted commands of his officers. Historical accounts from writers like Thucydides suggest that this sensory limitation heightened the sense of unity, as the formation itself became the soldier's entire world, a small island of order in the chaos of combat. The primary weapon was the doru, an 8-foot spear of strong ash wood with a leaf-shaped iron head and a bronze butt spike called a saurotur. This spike served as a counterbalance and allowed the spear to be planted in the ground. In the front ranks, the spear was held overhand, a deadly point projecting forward from the shield wall. For the men in the ranks behind, the spears were held upright, creating a dense screen that could help deflect incoming arrows. The process of an attack was methodical. The phalanx would advance at a walking pace, which would often quicken to a run in the final yards to build momentum. The goal was a physical collision, where the front lines would crash into the enemy with the full weight of the ranks behind them pushing forward. This brings us to the very mechanics of the phalanx in motion. It was not a nimble formation. Turning was a slow, difficult process that required every man to move in concert. A command to wheel right or left would ripple down the line, a complex shuffle of feet and shields. Its immense power was all directed forward. The greatest challenge, a problem that commanders wrestled with for centuries, was the vulnerability of its flanks and rear. If an enemy could get around the side of this dense block of men, the phalanx was in terrible danger. The soldiers on the ends of the line had no overlapping shields to protect them and could be rolled up with frightening speed. This inherent weakness meant that battles were often decided by which side could best protect its flanks, using terrain or smaller, more mobile units of troops. The materials used to create this formidable wall of warriors speak to the society that produced it. The bronze for the shields, helmets, and greaves, the shin guards worn by hoplites, was an expensive alloy of copper and tin. It required skilled metalworkers and significant resources, meaning each hoplite was typically a man of some means who had to supply his own equipment. This connection between property and military service was fundamental to the Greek city-state. The strong, straight-grained ash for the spears was carefully selected, and the iron for the spearheads represented another critical resource. Vase paintings from the era, which serve as invaluable historical records, frequently depict these hoplites with their iconic gear, often showing the individual symbols they painted on their shields to identify themselves and their families. The organization of this fighting force was a direct reflection of Greek civic life. These were not professional, full-time soldiers in the way we might think of them today. They were farmers, stonemasons, and merchants who drilled together and, when called upon, went to war to defend their city. This shared civic duty created a powerful social bond that translated directly into battlefield cohesion. The man you were defending was not an anonymous comrade, but the person whose farm bordered yours. This system of labor organization, where military duty was an extension of citizenship, fostered a level of commitment and morale that was difficult for armies of mercenaries or conscripts to match. Their training focused on maintaining the line, on not breaking formation, no matter the pressure. Of course, the phalanx was not a static concept. It evolved. For generations, it was the dominant force on the battlefields of Greece. But in the north, in the kingdom of Macedon, a king named Philip II saw both its strengths and its weaknesses. He took the core concept and made a critical change. He armed his soldiers not with the 8-foot doru, but with the sarissa, a massive pike that could be up to 18 feet long. Held with 2 hands, this longer weapon meant that the Macedonian phalanx could present a bristling wall of spear points that extended far in front of its front rank. An enemy would have to fight through 3, 4, or even 5 layers of deadly points before they could even reach the first Macedonian soldier. This tactical innovation, building upon the Greek foundation, created an almost unstoppable force. The Macedonian phalanx, heavier and more defensively powerful, required even greater training and discipline to maneuver its long pikes without them becoming a tangled mess. Yet, when wielded by Philip and later his son Alexander the Great, it proved capable of conquering a vast empire. The systematic development from the citizen hoplite to the professional Macedonian pikeman highlights a key pattern in military history: the constant refinement of existing methods to gain a crucial edge. These principles of cohesion, equipment, and the social structures needed to support an army are not relics of the past. The fundamental challenges of moving a group of people to a single purpose, trusting the individuals beside you, and leveraging technology remain as relevant today as they were on those dusty plains thousands of years ago. The sun-baked plains of Greece, with their solid walls of bronze and ashwood, represented one answer to the question of battle. But across the sea, in the hills of Italy, a different solution was taking shape. Here, on the training grounds outside a rising city called Rome, the sounds were not of a unified rhythmic chant, but of something more complex. The sharp, barking commands of a centurion, a man hardened by years of service, cut through the morning air. His voice was not by song, but by the steady, percussive thud of wooden swords hitting practice shields and the scuffing of countless leather sandals pivoting on the hard-packed earth. This was not the creation of a single living creature of war, but the assembly of a highly efficient machine, piece by disciplined piece. A young recruit, his arms aching from the unfamiliar weight, would spend his days in this environment. His focus was narrow and immediate, learning the precise sequence of motions that could mean the difference between life and death. First came the pilum, a heavy javelin engineered not just to pierce, but to disable. He learned to cast it with a short, powerful run, aiming for the enemy's shield. The process involved his whole body, from the planting of his feet to the snap of his arm. Following this, without a moment's hesitation, his hand would go to the hilt of his short sword, the gladius, kept on his right side for a quick, unobstructed draw. Every motion was repeated until it became second nature, performed without thought under the watchful, unforgiving eye of his trainer. This relentless drilling was the foundation of the entire Roman military system. From this individual training, a much larger and more flexible fighting formation emerged. Unlike the solid phalanx, which was powerful but cumbersome, the Roman legion was organized in a checkerboard pattern. The first units were called maniples, small independent blocks of soldiers with pathways between them. This structure allowed for incredible adaptability on the battlefield. A maniple could advance through the gaps, wheel to face a threat from the side, or fall back if it met heavy resistance, all without disrupting the entire line. Later, these were organized into larger blocks called cohorts, but the principle of flexibility remained. This system, detailed in the campaign accounts of generals like Julius Caesar, was a direct response to the rigid formations they often faced, allowing the legion to flow around obstacles and exploit weaknesses. The technical process of a Roman attack was a marvel of battlefield coordination built upon this flexible structure. As the legion advanced, the front ranks would unleash a volley of their pila. These javelins were ingeniously designed with a long, soft iron shank behind the hardened tip. When a pilum struck an enemy's shield, the shank would bend from the force of the impact. This made the javelin impossible to pull out and throw back, and the weight of it dangling from the shield made it awkward and heavy for the enemy to use. Consequently, the enemy line would be disrupted and disorganized, with many soldiers forced to discard their primary defense just as the disciplined Roman infantry closed in with their short swords drawn, ready for the brutal work ahead. This advance was not a single, desperate rush, but a controlled, systematic process of applying pressure. After the front line engaged the enemy, fighting in the close confines where the stabbing gladius was most effective, they would not fight to the point of exhaustion. Instead, on command, this first line would methodically disengage and retreat through the gaps left in the formation. As they moved to the rear to rest and regroup, the fresh second line, which had been waiting just behind them, would step forward to take their place. This cycling of fresh troops into the fight created a continuous, grinding pressure that could wear down even the most determined foe. It transformed a battle from a single frantic collision into a sustained, relentless assault. To support such a system, the materials of war had to be different. Where the Greek hoplites' equipment was often a product of individual wealth, the Roman legionaries' gear was a testament to a growing industrial scale. The iron for the gladius and the rings for the lorica hamata, or chainmail armor, were produced in vast quantities. This shift to iron meant that a state could equip thousands of soldiers with standardized, effective weapons and armor. Furthermore, the social organization that produced the soldier was fundamentally altered. A legionary was not a citizen taking up arms for a season. He was a professional who enlisted for a term of up to 25 years. His loyalty was not to his local city, but to his legion's eagle standard, his general, and the expanding power of Rome itself. This professionalization, however, presented its own set of immense challenges. A long-service army operating far from home required a constant and reliable stream of supplies. Food, equipment, and pay had to be delivered across hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles of hostile or difficult territory. As a result, the Roman army became as much an engineering and logistical force as a fighting one. Historical accounts, supported by archaeological findings at fortified camps from Britain to Mesopotamia, show that legionaries were expert builders. They constructed roads, bridges, and fortified camps with astonishing speed and precision. Maintaining the discipline to perform this hard labor after a long day's march, and then to fight effectively, was perhaps the greatest challenge of all for a Roman commander. The Roman military was therefore a complete system, where tactics, technology, and social structure were woven together. The discipline instilled on the training field allowed for the execution of complex maneuvers like the cohort rotation. The mass production of iron weapons provided the tools for this disciplined force to use, and the professional, long-service nature of the Army created a reliable instrument of state power capable of long campaigns and sophisticated logistical operations. Military manuals from the period, such as the writings of Vegetius, would later be studied for centuries, attempting to capture the essence of what made this military machine so successful. It was a formula that balanced individual training with unit cohesion and tactical flexibility. These methodical advancements in military organization and technology were not merely about winning battles. They were about building and sustaining an empire. The ability to deploy disciplined, well-supplied armies across vast distances became the foundation of Roman expansion and control. Each element, from the bendable shank of a javelin to the organized construction of an overnight camp, was a small part of a much larger strategic vision. Such innovations in military structure and process reveal the profound connection between how an army fights and the society it is built to defend. The disciplined formations of Greece and Rome were born of hilly landscapes and close-knit city-states. But on the vast open plains of the Near East, warfare took on a different character entirely. Here, distance was both a weapon and a vulnerability. For a foot soldier standing on the baked earth, the first sign of this new danger was not a sight, but a feeling, a deep, rhythmic vibration that traveled through the soles of his sandals and up into his bones. It was the sound of thunder on a cloudless day, a growing rumble that spoke of immense weight moving at great speed. Men would shift their weight, their grips tightening on their spears, their eyes scanning a horizon that shimmered under the unfiltered daylight, searching for the source of the tremor that promised to shake their world. Soon, the source would appear as a dark line, resolving itself into the shape of horses and whirling wheels. These were not simple carts for transport. They were scythed chariots, the shock weapons of Persian kings. The design was brutally simple. A lightweight wooden car, often armored with bronze or leather, was drawn by 2 or 4 powerful horses. The true terror, however, came from the long, sharpened blades that extended from the axles. As the wheels spun, these sights became a blur of steel, designed to cut a bloody path through the dense ranks of infantry. The technical process of their deployment was meant to maximize fear. They would not charge one at a time, but in a coordinated wave. The pounding of hooves and the rattle of the wooden frames, creating a harsh mix of sounds, meant to break a soldier's nerve long before the blades ever reached him. Historical accounts from the era, such as those recorded by the Greek soldier Xenophon in his work Anabasis, describe the immense psychological pressure these machines created. Yet, they also reveal a key vulnerability. The chariots were powerful but not agile. They needed momentum and a clear path. A disciplined infantry line, rather than standing rigid, could be trained to open channels, creating lanes through which the chariots would pass harmlessly. Once through the line, their momentum spent, the chariot crews were slow to turn and highly vulnerable to attack from the flanks and rear. This has led to a long-standing scholarly consideration. Was the scythe chariot a truly effective formation breaker, or was its primary function as a weapon of terror, designed to cause panic in less disciplined forces? The evidence suggests its impact was heavily dependent on the composure of its target. As the threat of the chariot passed, another, more subtle danger would often present itself on these endless plains. An opposing force of horsemen might engage briefly, then suddenly turn and begin to ride away. To a commander accustomed to decisive, close-quarters battle, this looked like a retreat, a sign of a broken enemy. The temptation to order a pursuit, to chase down the fleeing foe and win a glorious victory, was immense. Yet this was often a carefully laid trap, a complex maneuver that required an entirely different kind of military organization. The feigned retreat was a high-risk tactic that demanded absolute trust between the horsemen and their commanders, for a fake retreat could all too easily turn into a real one if panic took hold. The masters of this tactic were often nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples, like the Parthians, for whom horsemanship was not a military specialty, but the very center of their cultural identity. The social organization of such groups produced warriors who learned to ride as children, developing a bond with their mounts that a city-dwelling infantryman could scarcely comprehend. This lifelong training was the foundation for their military system. It allowed for the development of highly sophisticated battlefield communication through horns and banners, enabling large groups of horsemen to wheel, disperse, and regroup with a fluidity that seemed chaotic, but was in fact deeply controlled. This cultural foundation created a pool of warriors perfectly suited to the wide open terrain they called home. Their primary weapon was a marvel of engineering, a direct product of the materials available to them. The composite bow was far more than a simple piece of wood. It was constructed from layers of different materials laminated together. A wooden core, a layer of animal horn on the belly facing the archer, and a layer of sinew on the back. The horn resisted compression, while the sinew resisted tension. This combination stored a tremendous amount of energy when drawn, allowing the bow to be shorter than a wooden longbow, but just as powerful, if not more so. This made it the perfect weapon for a rider, compact enough to be wielded with ease from the back of a galloping horse. This combination of cultural skill and advanced technology resulted in one of history's most famous tactical maneuvers, the Parthian shot. As the horse archers feigned their retreat, luring their heavily armored pursuers deeper into the plain, they would perform an extraordinary feat. At full gallop, the rider would twist his entire upper body around in the saddle, aim backward over the horse's rump, and release an arrow into the ranks of the pursuing enemy. This was not a random parting shot. It was a disciplined volley delivered by hundreds of riders at once. The technical process was breathtaking, requiring a lifetime of practice to master the art of shooting accurately from an unstable platform while simultaneously controlling a horse with leg pressure alone. For a force like a Roman legion, this was a tactical nightmare. Roman accounts from disastrous campaigns, most famously the Battle of Carrhae, are filled with a sense of helplessness. The legionaries, masters of close order combat, could not get to grips with an enemy that refused to stand and fight. Advancing meant being peppered with arrows from a distance. Holding a defensive formation, like the square-shaped testudo with shields overhead, offered some protection, but made them a static target, unable to move without exposing themselves. The Parthians would simply circle them, a Cantabrian circle, as it was sometimes known, launching arrows continuously, withdrawing to be resupplied by camels carrying fresh quivers, and wearing down the heavily armored infantry with 1,000 small cuts. The psychological effect of this method was profound. It reversed the expected order of battle. The heavily armed soldier, who expected to be the aggressor, was forced into a passive, defensive posture. His strength and discipline, normally his greatest assets, became liabilities, rooting him to the spot, while a more mobile enemy dictated the terms of the engagement. The vast open ground, which a commander might have seen as a perfect field for a decisive battle, was transformed by these tactics into a killing floor, where space itself became the enemy's greatest ally. It was a clear demonstration that there was no single, perfect way of waging war. This reality forced a profound adaptation in military thinking. The success of mobile, ranged armies proved that terrain and cultural strengths were not just contributing factors, but could be the central pillars upon which an entire military doctrine was built. The heavy infantry that had come to dominate the battlefields of the Mediterranean found its limits on the steppes and deserts of the East. Generals learned, often through bitter defeat, that tactics developed in one environment could be entirely unsuited for another. This realization underscored a fundamental truth of conflict. The ability to adapt was just as important as the ability to fight. This deep study of divergent military systems reveals the powerful ways in which geography and cultural practice could shape the very nature of armed struggle. The battlefields of the open plain, where formations clashed and cavalry charged, were only one theater of ancient conflict. Another kind of war, slower and more methodical, was fought not against a moving army, but against stone and wood, against high walls and determined defenders. Outside a fortified city, the nature of conflict transformed entirely. Here, the dominant sounds were not the clash of swords, but the steady, rhythmic work of a vast construction camp. The sharp crack of an axe biting into a tree trunk echoed from a nearby forest, followed by the splintering groan of its fall. In the camp itself, the day was marked by the clang of hammers striking iron, a constant pulse from the forges where smiths crafted bolts and fittings, their eyes watering from the fumes that drifted from the fires. The air carried the scent of freshly cut timber, the sharpness of hot metal, and the earthy smell of thousands of men and animals living in close quarters. This was the art of the siege, a contest of engineering, patience, and sheer will. This methodical process of assault began with the systematic dismantling of the surrounding countryside. An army could not build its engines of war without immense quantities of resources, and so the landscape for miles around would be stripped bare. Specialized teams of soldiers, organized not for combat but for labor, ventured out each day. Woodcutters, protected by armed guards, felled the largest, straightest trees, which were then hauled back to camp by oxen. The sheer scale of this logistical effort was enormous, requiring a level of organization far beyond that of a simple raiding party. An entire army had to become a moving factory. The leadership had to think like master builders, identifying the right kinds of timber for different tasks. Strong oak for the frames of siege engines, more flexible ash for ladder rungs, and countless smaller pieces for scaffolding and supports. The transformation of the landscape was the first act of war against a city, an attempt to isolate it and turn its own natural defenses into the weapons of its downfall. From this great harvest of timber, the siege engines began to take shape. Perhaps the most direct tool was the battering ram. This was far more than a simple log. A massive iron-capped beam would be suspended by chains or ropes from a heavy timber frame. The entire structure was then covered by a thick roof of wood and animal hides, a shelter the Romans called a testudo, or tortoise. These hides were often soaked in water or vinegar to prevent the defenders from setting them alight with fire arrows. Teams of men, protected inside this mobile shed, would swing the great beam back and forth, building a powerful rhythm to strike a gate or a section of wall again and again. Historical accounts, such as those by the historian Josephus describing the Roman sieges in Judea, detail the terrifying percussive impact of these machines, a sound that could demoralize a city's inhabitants long before the wall itself gave way. While the ram focused on a single point, another creation aimed to overcome the very height of the walls, the siege tower. These were monumental undertakings, multi-storied wooden structures on wheels, often as tall as the fortifications they were meant to assault. Assembling one was a complex engineering feat. A massive base was constructed first, upon which a towering framework of heavy beams was raised, braced at every angle for strength. The side facing the city was covered in fire-resistant hides, while the other sides were left open to save weight. Inside, a series of internal ladders or ramps allowed soldiers to climb to the upper levels. At the very top, a hinged drawbridge could be lowered onto the enemy ramparts, allowing the attackers to pour directly onto the walls. The process of moving such a colossal structure into position was slow and perilous, requiring dozens of men or teams of oxen to push and pull it across leveled ground, all while under fire from the defenders above. Beyond these direct assault machines, a more distant and calculated form of warfare was waged by torsion-powered artillery. These were not gunpowder weapons, but complex engines that derived their power from tightly twisted ropes, usually made of animal sinew or horsehair. One type, the ballista, functioned like a giant crossbow, capable of shooting heavy iron-tipped bolts with enough force to pierce shields and men at several hundred yards. Another, the catapult, or onager, used a single rotating arm to hurl heavy stones in a high arc, aiming to smash the battlements and buildings within the city. These weapons required specialist crews, men who understood the complex physics of tension and trajectory. They were the engineers of the ancient battlefield, methodically calculating range and adjusting their aim, slowly but surely dismantling the enemy's defenses from a distance. The reliefs on Trajan's column in Rome provide a remarkable visual record, a frozen encyclopedia of these very engines being used by Roman legions. The battle for the walls was not merely a one-sided affair of attack. The defenders waged their own desperate, inventive war in response. For every offensive technique, a countermeasure was developed, turning the siege into a deadly duel of innovation. As attackers tunneled beneath the walls in a process called undermining, hoping to collapse a section of the foundation, defenders would dig counter tunnels, listening for the faint sounds of enemy pickaxes. These subterranean encounters often resulted in grim, close-quarters fighting in the dark. From the walls, defenders would use long poles with hooks to try and catch and overturn siege towers, or they would drop massive stones to crush the roofs of battering rams. Cauldrons of hot oil, boiling water, or even heated sand, which was particularly effective at getting inside armor, were poured down upon any soldier who dared approach the base of the wall. This constant back and forth between attacker and defender highlights a central truth of siege warfare. It was often a contest between the methodical, well-supplied engineering of a large army and the desperate, localized ingenuity of a trapped population. While Roman siegecraft is often remembered for its systematic approach, other cultures developed their own effective methods. The Assyrians, for instance, were masters of building enormous earthen ramps to simply overwhelm a city's defenses, a brute force approach that required immense manpower. The Greeks, known for their scientific minds, refined the designs of catapults, turning them into more precise instruments of war. The comparison of these techniques shows that there was no single solution. The methods used were shaped by the available materials, the particular geography, and the military traditions of the besieging army. Ultimately, the greatest challenge for a besieging army was not the enemy's walls, but the passage of time itself. A prolonged siege was a logistical nightmare. An army of thousands needed a constant supply of food, water, and fodder for its animals. Disease could sweep through a crowded military camp with devastating speed. Morale was a fragile thing, worn down by the tedium of construction, the constant danger of raids from the city, and the frustration of slow progress. A commander was always racing against the calendar. The coming of winter could make a continued siege impossible, and there was always the risk that a friendly army might arrive to relieve the besieged city. This pressure of time forced commanders to weigh their options carefully. Was it better to risk a costly and bloody direct assault, or to play the long game of starvation, hoping the city's supplies would run out before their own? This strategic calculation, a cold arithmetic of supplies and morale, elevated siegecraft from a mere engineering problem to a high form of military art. The commander had to be a logistician, an engineer, and a psychologist all at once. Archaeological excavations at sites like Masada in modern-day Israel reveal the sheer scale of the Roman effort.
including the remains of their camps and the massive assault ramp they built, a silent testament to their relentless determination. These physical remains, combined with detailed textual accounts from historians like Polybius, allow us to understand the immense organizational effort required. An entire military society had to be created outside the city walls, complete with its own routines, its own specialists, and its own internal pressures, all focused on the single goal of breaching the defenses.
The slow, grinding nature of a siege, therefore, represented a different kind of human conflict. It was less about the fleeting bravery of a single charge and more about the sustained, collective effort of an organized group. The construction of a single siege tower or the methodical operation of a catapult was a testament to how human ingenuity could be harnessed to overcome even the most formidable physical obstacles. This methodical application of engineering and labor illustrates how armies learned to master not just the battlefield, but the very landscape of war itself. The methodical work of the siege camp gives way now to the open field, where the science of war finds a different, more fluid expression. We move to a wide, dusty plain in southern Italy, bordered by the shallow Alpheus River. Here, two of the ancient world's greatest military powers are arrayed for battle. On one side, the legions of Rome stand in their deep, checkerboard formations, a vision of disciplined power. The light catches the bronze of their helmets and the iconic curved red shields, creating a singular, unified presence. The rhythmic tramp of their sandals on the dry earth is a sound of immense confidence. Facing them is a different sight altogether. The army of Carthage, a vibrant and varied collection of warriors from across the Mediterranean, led by the brilliant general Hannibal Barca. Their line is a mix of Spanish infantry with their straight swords, tall Celtic warriors, and disciplined Libyan spearmen, their equipment a reflection of their diverse origins. This battle, which history would remember as Cannae, was not to be a simple clash of shield walls. It was designed by one man as a complex machine, with each part moving in concert to achieve a single, devastating purpose. The Roman commanders, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, saw what appeared to be a weakness in the Carthaginian line. Hannibal had arranged his Spanish and Celtic infantry in the center, pushing them forward in a shallow crescent shape that seemed thin and ready to break. Confident in the legion's ability to punch through any opposition, the Romans began their advance. Their thousands of soldiers moved forward as one, a dense tide of infantry meant to crush the Carthaginian center through sheer weight and pressure. Skirmishers from both sides darted ahead, their thrown javelins and whirring slingstones creating the first sharp sounds of the engagement, a prelude to the main collision. To orchestrate such a complex plan required a level of command and control that was almost unheard of. Hannibal's army was a coalition of peoples who spoke different languages and fought with different weapons. It included Numidian horsemen from North Africa who were masters of light cavalry tactics, and heavy cavalry from Spain and Gaul. This mix of forces was both a strength and a monumental challenge. Unlike the uniform Roman army, where commands were standardized, Hannibal had to rely on a chain of trusted officers to translate his intentions to each national group. Communication was a matter of horns, flags, and messengers who had drilled these specific movements for months. The entire operation rested on the trust these varied soldiers placed not in an abstract state, but in the commander who had led them successfully from Spain, over the Alps, and into the heart of Italy. As the Roman legions pressed their attack, the crescent of Celtic and Spanish troops in the center began to perform their critical, pre-planned role. They fought fiercely, but slowly gave ground, bending backward under the immense Roman pressure. This maneuver was the first part of the trap, designed to pull the legions deeper and deeper into the Carthaginian formation. The Roman soldiers, sensing victory, surged forward with even greater intensity, their formations becoming more compressed as they funneled into the receding pocket. To the Roman commanders, it must have looked like the beginning of a rout. But on the flanks of the battle, a far more decisive action was unfolding. The Carthaginian heavy cavalry, under Hannibal's subordinate Hasdrubal, charged and shattered their Roman counterparts, sending them fleeing from the field. This was the moment where discipline and strategic vision overcame the simple instinct for pursuit. Instead of chasing the broken Roman horsemen, Hasdrubal executed a maneuver of stunning complexity. He rallied his cavalry and led them on a wide arc around the entire rear of the Roman infantry, which was still focused on crushing the Carthaginian center. This movement was the hammer, swinging around to strike the back of the Roman formation that was now firmly held in place by the anvil of Hannibal's infantry. At the same time, the elite Libyan infantry, which Hannibal had held in reserve on his flanks, turned inward, attacking the exposed sides of the now overextended Roman legions. The Roman army, moments before seemingly on the verge of victory, found itself completely surrounded. The trap was sprung. The genius of the plan lay in its systems-level integration. It was a perfect example of combined arms, where each element performed a function that enabled the success of the others. The light infantry had harassed the advance. The central infantry had absorbed the main blow and drawn the enemy in. The heavy cavalry had cleared the flanks and sealed the rear, and the reserve infantry had delivered the final blows. Such a victory raises a question that historians continue to explore. Was this the singular product of a great man, a commander of unparalleled genius, or was it the ultimate expression of a military system so well drilled and so loyal that it could execute a plan that required some of its elements to feign retreat and absorb heavy losses? The truth, most likely, lies in a combination of both. Inside the encirclement, the disciplined order of the legions dissolved into a desperate struggle for survival. The sheer press of bodies meant many Roman soldiers barely had room to lift their shields or draw their short gladius swords, tools designed for disciplined formation fighting. Breathing became labored as the space tightened, and the structured lines of the cohorts collapsed into a chaotic mass. The materials of war that had been their strength now became a weakness. Their heavy armor made movement sluggish, and their large shields were clumsy encumbrances in the crush. In contrast,
Hannibal's forces on the outside had space to maneuver, their cavalry striking from the rear while his spearmen and swordsmen pressed in from the front and sides. The historical accounts of this battle, preserved for us primarily by the writings of the Roman historian Livy and the Greek historian Polybius, are a testament to its tactical perfection and its human cost. They detail a level of strategic artistry that transformed the battlefield from a simple contest of strength into a complex intellectual puzzle. Modern military analysis, using tools like wargaming and digital simulations, continues to study the Battle of Cannae. It is dissected not as a piece of ancient history, but as a timeless lesson in strategy, risk, and the psychological dimensions of warfare. It demonstrates how a smaller, more diverse force can defeat a larger, more uniform one through superior planning and coordination.
Ultimately, the clash on the fields of Cannae was more than a battle. It was a powerful demonstration of a new level of military thought. It showed that the individual components of an army, infantry, cavalry, skirmishers, could be woven together into something far greater than the sum of their parts. The principles of luring an enemy, of using a feigned weakness to create a fatal strength, and of coordinating a decisive envelopment were displayed with devastating clarity. Such carefully executed maneuvers, combining different types of forces in a single, coherent plan, underscore the enduring questions about the interplay between battlefield innovation and the established doctrines of military power. From the complex, coordinated movements of Hannibal's army, the art of warfare now travels north and forward in time, into a different landscape and a different society. Here, on the fields of medieval Europe, another kind of battlefield creature was born, one not of intricate formations, but of singular, concentrated power. The ground itself seems to change its rhythm, no longer marked by the steady tramp of legions, but by a deep, resonant drumming that grows from a tremor into a thunder. It is the sound of hundreds of iron-shod hooves, a sound that signals the arrival of the iron-clad charge. For the men on foot who stood waiting, it was a force of nature condensed into a line of men and animals aimed directly at their hearts. Imagine a man encased almost entirely in metal. The world is a narrow slit of light seen through the visor of a great helmet. His breathing is loud in his own ears, mixing with the jingle of his mail shirt, called a hauberk, and the creak of thick leather. Beneath him is not merely a horse, but a destrier, a war horse bred for size and strength, its own breath steaming in the cool morning. The rider is not just sitting on this animal, he is locked into it. A high-backed saddle cups his hips, bracing him against the violent shock to come. His feet are planted firmly in iron stirrups, allowing him to stand and deliver a blow with his full weight. This combination of technologies turned two living beings into a single, unified weapon system, a projectile of flesh and steel. This brings us to the very heart of the technique, the couched lance. The weapon itself was a long, heavy spear of ash wood with a wicked iron tip. But it was not meant to be thrown or simply jabbed. Instead, the rider tucked the thick shaft of the lance under his armpit, bracing it against his body.
This simple act, known as couching the lance, transformed its function entirely. Now, the point of the lance would deliver not just the strength of the rider's arm, but the entire combined momentum of a 1,000-pound horse and a fully armored man moving at a full gallop. It was a transfer of energy so immense that it could punch through a shield, pierce mail, and throw a man from his feet with bone-shattering force. Now, you might wonder how such a powerful force was deployed. The process was far more methodical than a simple wild rush. The knights would first form a line, sometimes several ranks deep. They would begin their advance at a slow trot, a pace designed to maintain their alignment. Cohesion was the greatest challenge. Each knight was an aristocrat, a wealthy and powerful individual, often motivated by a desire for personal glory. A commander's constant struggle was to prevent these proud warriors from breaking formation and charging ahead on their own. As they closed the distance to their target, the call would be given to increase the pace to a canter, and then for the final 100 yards or so to a full, earth-shaking gallop, lowering their lances in unison just before impact.
Historical accounts from the period, such as the Chronicles of the Crusades, describe the effect of such a charge as overwhelming. An infantry line that held its nerve might present a dense wall of braced spears, a dangerous thicket for the horses. But if even a small section of that line faltered, if their courage broke for just a moment, the knights would smash through the gap like a flood through a broken dam. The initial impact was designed for shock, to break the enemy's formation and their will to fight. What followed was the melee, a chaotic swirl of combat, where, having discarded their splintered lances, the knights would draw their heavy swords and maces to fight in the gaps they had created. This entire method of fighting was a direct product of the social and economic system of the time, feudalism. The materials required to create one of these warriors were astonishingly expensive. A suit of mail, and later full plate armor, was the work of a master craftsman, costing as much as a small farm. The destrier warhorse was a specialized animal, costly to breed, feed, and train. This immense investment meant that this type of warfare was the exclusive domain of a land-owning nobility. In return for their grant of land from a lord or king, these men owed military service, arriving for battle with their own equipment and followers. This social organization, known as the feudal levy, directly shaped the armies of the age. The challenges of this system, however, were significant. While powerful, the feudal army was often a fractious and undisciplined force. A king might struggle to command his own powerful nobles, who saw themselves as his partners rather than his subjects. The quest for individual honor, the desire to capture a wealthy opponent for ransom, often took precedence over tactical objectives. A commander's battle plan could easily fall apart if a group of knights decided to charge prematurely in pursuit of glory. This tension between coordinated action was a constant feature of medieval battlefields. The visual record left behind in illuminated manuscripts, such as the famous Bayeux Tapestry depicting the Norman conquest of England, provides a rich source of evidence for these tactics. Though stylized, these images clearly show knights on horseback, lances couched, charging into a wall of Saxon shields. They also show the consequences: men and horses tumbling to the ground, the chaos of the melee, and the effectiveness of counter-tactics like a well-formed shield wall. We see the system in action, frozen in threads of colored wool. These sources show that while the charge was a fearsome weapon, it was not invincible. Infantry formations learned to adapt. They stood their ground, their long spears angled to present an almost impenetrable hedge of points aimed at the chests of the horses. Archers, a growing threat on the battlefield, could disrupt a cavalry charge before it ever reached its target, felling horses and wounding riders, causing the carefully maintained formation to lose its momentum and cohesion. The knightly charge, for all its power, required very specific conditions to be successful: open ground and a wavering or poorly prepared opponent. When faced with disciplined infantry and massed missile fire, its limitations became painfully clear. This method of warfare represented a peak of individual combat prowess, where technology and a lifetime of training were embodied in a single warrior. The charge itself was a physical calculation, a complex equation of mass, velocity, and morale. It was a system where the social structure of a continent was reflected in its primary military tactic, with a land-owning class of warriors dominating the open field. Their very appearance was designed to project power and inspire fear, a role they fulfilled for several centuries. This connection between a society and its preferred way of making war is one of the most fascinating aspects of military history. The knight was not just a soldier. He was the physical manifestation of a social order built on land, loyalty, and martial obligation. His equipment was his badge of office, and the charge was his ultimate expression of purpose. It was a brutal, effective, and deeply personal form of combat that defined an entire era of European history. The effectiveness of this armored warrior, however, was tied directly to the technology and social structures that created him. As new forces began to appear on the battlefield, forces that we will soon explore, the dominance of the ironclad charge began to wane. Yet, for a time, it was the undisputed king of the battlefield, a human thunderbolt that could decide the fate of a kingdom in a few heart-pounding moments. Modern scholarship, using methods from experimental archaeology to reconstruct and test the physics of the couched lance, continues to reveal new insights into the immense power and intricate social underpinnings of this iconic form of combat. Following the intricate dance of combined arms, where infantry, cavalry, and skirmishers moved in a complex partnership, the focus of warfare in some parts of Europe shifted dramatically. It narrowed to the power of a single weapon in the hands of a common man, a development that would challenge the very foundations of the medieval social order. We move now to a damp field in France during the long and bitter struggle known as the 100 Years' War. The ground is soft underfoot, a churned mix of mud and grass that clings to boots and makes movement a deliberate effort. For the men standing in long lines, this clinging earth is an advantage, a foundation upon which to build a defense. An English archer stands in one of these lines, his feet planted wide for balance. In his left hand, he holds a staff of wood taller than he is. It is yew, a material he knows by touch alone. Feeling the familiar texture of the pale sapwood on the outside curve, and the darker, resilient heartwood on the inside. This combination gives the stave its remarkable power. He takes a deep breath, the cool, moist air filling his lungs. Across the field, he can see the enemy forming up, a glittering mass of steel, colorful banners, and impatient war horses. He and the men beside him are dressed in simple padded jacks and steel caps, a stark contrast to the plate-armored French nobility they are about to face. The technical process of their work is about to begin, a drill repeated so many times it has become second nature. On command, each man drives the sharpened end of a long stake into the ground before him, angling it toward the enemy. This simple piece of wood is their primary defense against the one thing they truly fear, the crushing weight of a cavalry charge. With this barrier in place, the archer pulls an arrow from the quiver at his belt or from the ground beside him, where many have been planted for quick access. He inspects the fletching, the goose feathers that will guide its flight, and the arrowhead, a narrow, hardened spike of iron called a bodkin, designed for one purpose: to punch through armor. Placing the arrow's notched end, or nock, onto the thick hemp bowstring, he awaits the next command. When it comes, he begins the draw. This is not an act of arm strength alone. It is a full body movement. He pushes the bow away with his left arm while pulling the string back with his right, engaging the powerful muscles of his back and shoulders. Sweat begins to bead on his forehead from the sheer effort, as he must pull back a string requiring over 100 pounds of force to draw fully. He anchors the string at the corner of his mouth, his eye sighting down the length of the arrow shaft, a process that has been ingrained in him since boyhood. Then comes the final command, to loose. In near perfect unison, thousands of fingers release their strings. The sound is not a twang, but something much larger, a deep, resonant hum that seems to make the very air vibrate, followed by a sound that chronicles of the time, such as those written by Jean Froissart, describe as a great ripping of cloth. A dark cloud of arrows ascends into the sky, blotting out the sun for a moment before beginning its steep descent. This is not aimed fire in the way one might imagine a single archer hunting game. It is volley fire, an arrow storm designed to blanket a wide area with lethal projectiles, making it nearly impossible for an advancing enemy to escape untouched. The devastating effectiveness of this system lay in its rate of fire. A skilled longbowman could loose 10 or even 12 arrows in a single minute. When multiplied by several thousand archers, the result was an unrelenting shower of iron-tipped shafts. For the advancing French knights, the experience was terrifying. The sky would darken, and arrows would rain down, striking men and, crucially, their unarmored horses. A wounded, panicking horse could throw its rider and disrupt the entire charge, turning an organized formation into a chaotic and vulnerable mass of struggling men and animals.
The disciplined repetition of the English archers created a killing zone that broke charges before they could ever reach the main line. This formidable military capability was not born overnight. The labor organization required to produce such soldiers was a long-term social investment by the English crown. Laws were passed requiring men to practice archery on Sundays, and other sports were discouraged to ensure a constant supply of skilled bowmen. A boy would start with a smaller bow, gradually moving to more powerful ones as his strength grew. It took a lifetime of constant practice to develop the physical strength and skill to use the war bow effectively. This created a unique class of soldier, a commoner, often a simple yeoman farmer who could defeat a wealthy, aristocratic knight from a distance. The materials involved were as specific as the training. The best bows were made from the yew trees that grew in Spain and Italy, their wood prized for its natural lamination of flexible sapwood and strong heartwood. Bowstrings were made of hemp or flax, and arrows were mass-produced from ash or birch, fletched with goose feathers. The sheer quantity of arrows required for a campaign was immense. Archaeological discoveries, such as the thousands of arrows recovered from the wreck of the 16th century warship, the Mary Rose, give us a tangible sense of the industrial scale of this production. Each arrow was a carefully crafted piece of military hardware.
This reliance on a single, powerful technology raises an interesting point that scholars still discuss. Was the longbow the sole reason for English victories at famous battles like Crécy and Agincourt? Or were other factors equally, if not more, important? The historical accounts make it clear that the French often made critical tactical errors, such as charging uphill across muddy, broken ground, which exhausted their knights and horses before they even reached the English lines. The English, by contrast, were often excellent at choosing defensive terrain that maximized the longbow's strengths while negating the power of the French charge. The answer likely lies in a combination of factors. The longbow was undoubtedly a revolutionary weapon, but its success depended on the discipline of the men who wielded it, the wisdom of the commanders who deployed them, and, sometimes, the simple luck of the weather. What is certain is that the arrow storm represented a profound social shift on the battlefield. It demonstrated that a well-trained force of common infantry, equipped with the right weapon and employed with smart tactics, could overcome the armored elite that had dominated European warfare for centuries. This shift had consequences that reached far beyond the battlefield. The image of a nobleman being struck down by an anonymous archer 100 yards away was a powerful symbol. It subtly undermined the martial ideology of the feudal system, which was built on the knight's personal prowess in close combat. Warfare was becoming more impersonal, more reliant on drilled formations and ranged firepower, a trend that would only accelerate with the later introduction of gunpowder. The longbowman, standing firm in the mud, was a precursor to the disciplined professional infantrymen who would come to dominate the wars of the future. The physical toll on the archers themselves was considerable. Modern analysis of skeletons found in medieval grave sites, believed to be those of longbowmen, shows significant skeletal changes. The bones of the left arm are
often larger and more robust, and the spine and shoulders show signs of massive and repeated stress, a direct result of drawing such a powerful bow thousands upon thousands of times. Their very bodies were reshaped by their profession, a silent record of the immense physical demands of their craft.
The accounts from the period, combined with the physical evidence of the weapons and the very bones of the men who used them, provide a rich and detailed picture of this form of warfare. The tales of arrow storms that could darken the sky were not exaggerations, but descriptions of a terrifyingly effective military system. The skeletal remains from these conflicts, marked by the distinctive puncture wounds of the bodkin point, offer a silent chronicle of the weapon's power that experts continue to interpret. For centuries, the rhythm of a battlefield had been a thing of steel and sinew. It was the sharp ring of sword on shield, the thud of an arrow striking wood, the war cry from 1,000 throats. But as the late medieval world gave way to the first hints of the Renaissance, a new sound began to impose itself upon this familiar landscape. It was not a clash or a cry, but a deep, earth-shaking boom, a roar that seemed to tear the very fabric of the air. It was the voice of gunpowder, and it spoke of a world about to be remade. In a field outside a besieged city, the scene was not one of noble knights preparing for a charge, but of craftsmen and laborers engaged in a dangerous, almost alchemical process. Before a cannon could ever fire, it had to be born from fire itself. This process began with the creation of a mold. A long, cannon-shaped core of clay and rope was carefully fashioned, then coated in layers of fine clay and animal hair, each layer dried and hardened. This formed the inner shape of the barrel. This core was then suspended inside a larger, stronger outer casing, and the space between them would become the cannon. Nearby, a furnace roared, its heat so intense that men working near it had to shield their faces with leather flaps. Their movements were sluggish, and they paused often to wipe sweat from their brows with gritty hands. The very air they breathed seemed to shimmer. Inside the furnace, bronze or iron melted into a glowing liquid sun, a process that required immense quantities of fuel and expert knowledge to manage the temperature.
When the metal was finally ready, a hush fell over the workers. This was the most dangerous moment. The furnace was tapped, and a river of incandescent metal flowed down a clay channel and into the waiting mold. The intense light forced the craftsmen to turn their heads, their eyes stinging even from a distance. The mold sizzled and steamed as the molten bronze filled every space, a testament to the materials and skill required for this new form of warfare. It would take days for the massive casting to cool enough to be handled. Only then could the outer mold be broken away and the inner core painstakingly removed, revealing the rough shape of a cannon barrel. From there, more specialized labor was needed to bore the inside smooth, a slow and difficult task that determined the weapon's safety and accuracy. Once finished and mounted on a heavy wooden carriage, the cannon was a fearsome sight. Surviving examples, like the great Mons Meg, still found in Scotland, give a sense of the sheer scale of these early weapons. Transporting such a beast to the battlefield was a major logistical challenge, requiring teams of oxen and dozens of men to drag it over poor roads. Its place was not initially in the swirling chaos of an open field battle, but in the methodical, grinding work of a siege. Here, its true power could be brought to bear against the great stone walls of a castle, fortifications that had stood for centuries against catapults and battering rams. The very presence of a cannon battery outside a city's walls shifted the psychological balance of a siege, turning a waiting game into a countdown. The technical process of firing one of these early cannons was a slow and deliberate ritual. First, a measured amount of black powder, a coarse mixture of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur, was ladled into the barrel. This was a new and vital material, requiring its own complex supply chain that stretched from mines to refineries. Following the powder, a wad of cloth or grass was pushed down the barrel, and then came the projectile itself. In the earliest days, this was often a carefully shaped stone ball, weighing hundreds of pounds. Finally, a fine priming powder was poured into a small touch hole at the rear of the cannon. The crew would stand back, and one man, often the master gunner, would approach with a long, slow-burning rope called a match.
The moment the glowing match touched the priming powder, the world changed. There was a flash, a hiss, and then a deafening explosion that slammed into the bodies of everyone nearby like a physical blow. A thick cloud of white smoke, reeking of sulfur, instantly obscured the target. Men's ears would ring for hours afterward, and their eyes would water from the harsh fumes that drifted back over their position. The ground itself would tremble with the force of the recoil. For those inside the besieged castle, the experience was even more terrifying. The impact of a massive stone ball traveling at high speed did not just chip away at the walls, it shattered them. It was a brutal, impersonal force that rendered centuries of defensive architecture suddenly vulnerable. This new technology was a profound disruption to the established systems of warfare. The power of the feudal order was built, quite literally, on the strength of its stone castles. A nobleman could defy a king from behind his high walls, safe from arrows and swords. Gunpowder changed this calculation entirely. Suddenly, the most important figure in a siege was not the most courageous knight, but the most knowledgeable master gunner, a man who understood angles, chemistry, and metallurgy. As period treatises on gunnery and fortification show, a technological arms race began. Castle builders responded with thicker, lower walls and sloping earthworks designed to absorb the shock of cannonballs. But the advantage had decisively shifted to the attacker. On the open battlefield, the initial impact of cannons was less clear. Their incredibly slow rate of fire, sometimes only a few shots per hour, and their lack of accuracy made them far less effective against moving troops. A line of infantry could often advance between volleys. Furthermore, they were immobile once a battle began. If the fighting shifted, the cannons were often left behind or captured. Their primary role was to create fear and disruption, to fire a few opening shots that might break the cohesion of an enemy formation before the real fighting, the clash of steel on steel, began. But even here, they signaled a change. The sound, the smoke, and the sheer destructive power introduced a new and terrifying element to combat. The social organization of armies began to transform in response. The immense cost of casting cannons, buying powder, and hiring skilled gunners was beyond the means of most individual nobles. Only kings and powerful states could afford to build and maintain a modern artillery train. This centralization of military power was a key factor in the decline of feudalism and the rise of the nation-state. Engineering and technical expertise became qualities as valuable as noble birth and martial prowess. The forge and the laboratory were becoming as important as the training yard and the armory, altering the very foundation upon which military power was built. This development can be seen in the archaeological evidence from besieged castles of the era. Walls once considered unbreakable show the distinct, brutal pockmarks of cannon fire, sometimes with old stone projectiles still embedded within them. The remains tell a story of a desperate struggle between old defensive methods and a new, overwhelming offensive technology. The shift was not just about breaking walls. It was about breaking an entire way of thinking about war. The individual heroism of the knight charging across the field was slowly being overshadowed by the impersonal, mechanical power of a machine operated by a team of trained specialists. The internal conflict for commanders of the time must have been significant. Here was a weapon of incredible power, yet it was also unreliable, slow, and prone to catastrophic failure. A poorly cast cannon could explode, killing its own crew. A damp batch of powder might fail to ignite. A commander had to weigh the potential to shatter an enemy's fortress or morale against the immense logistical burden and the inherent risks of this new technology. To embrace it was to invest in an uncertain future. To ignore it was to risk being left behind, to see one's own stone walls crumble to dust. This choice, repeated across countless battlefields and sieges, pushed warfare in a new direction. The harsh mix of sounds on the battlefield grew more complex, the air more choked with chemical haze. Soldiers now had to contend not just with the weapons of their enemies, but with the disorienting, deafening power of their own. It was a new kind of sensory warfare, one that attacked the nerves as much as the body. The age of the silent, orderly advance was giving way to the age of the shrouded, thundering field. The evolution of gunpowder weapons was a slow but relentless process, driven by the constant search for advantage. This shift from muscle and steel to chemical force and engineered power was a stark reflection of the universal human tendency to innovate in the face of conflict, reshaping society in the process. The clash of steel and the thunder of a cavalry charge had defined battlefields for centuries. But on the plains of 16th century Europe, a new sound was becoming common. It was not a single deafening boom, but a series of distinct noises. The metallic click and clatter of firearms being prepared, the gruff shouts of sergeants, and then a rolling crackle of explosions. A moment later, a dense white cloud would drift across the field, making eyes water and throats raw with its sulphurous bite. Through this haze, a new kind of formation stood firm, a bristling square of men that moved with the slow, grinding certainty of a glacier. This was the age of pike and shot,
a solution to a deadly puzzle that gunpowder had placed before commanders. This formation, most famously perfected by the Spanish as the tercio, was a marvel of battlefield engineering. It was a dense block of soldiers, a living fortress designed to be unshakable. The outer ranks were a forest of ashwood pikes, some as long as 18 feet, their polished steel heads glinting just above the heads of the men. This wall of spears presented an almost impossible obstacle for charging horsemen, whose mounts would shy away from the thicket of points. Within this protective hedgehog, sheltered from the immediate shock of combat, were the men with the new weapons, the musketeers. They were the offensive power of the formation, but they were also its most vulnerable component.
To understand the genius of this system, one must first understand the frustrating clumsiness of an early firearm. The matchlock musket was a heavy, unwieldy instrument. Firing it was a complicated and lengthy process, a sequence of at least a dozen distinct steps that had to be performed under the most stressful conditions imaginable. A soldier would first have to measure a charge of coarse black powder from a flask, pour it down the long barrel, and then use a ramrod to push a lead ball down against it. After that, he had to place a small amount of finer powder in a priming pan near the back of the barrel. Only then could he bring the match, a length of slow-burning cord, into contact with the pan to ignite the charge. This entire sequence could take a minute or more, even for a well-drilled soldier. During that time, the musketeer was completely defenseless, a perfect target for a charging knight or a rival infantryman. Because of this inherent weakness, the musketeers could not operate alone. They required protection, a sanctuary where they could reload in relative safety. This is where the tactical brilliance of the pike and shot formation becomes clear. The musketeers were often positioned at the corners of the Great Pike Square, in formations known as sleeves or mangas. From here, they could step forward, deliver their volley, and then retreat back into the safety of the pikeman's embrace while they began the slow work of reloading. The battlefield thus became a place of carefully managed rhythms. The sergeants, distinguished by their polearms called halberds, would call out the commands, orchestrating the movements of the two groups. A command would send a rank of musketeers forward. Another command would see them level their heavy weapons, propping the barrels on forked stands to steady their aim. At the final order, they would lower their glowing match cords into the priming pans, unleashing a volley of smoke and lead. As the next rank moved forward to repeat the process, the first would filter back behind the protective wall of pikes, their hands already working to measure powder and ram home the next shot. It was a slow, grinding, and terrifyingly methodical way to fight. The materials required for this new warfare reflected a shift in military logistics. The pikes were simple enough, requiring long, straight-grained shafts of ash wood and forged steel heads. The muskets, however, were more complex, demanding skilled metal workers to forge the barrels and craft the intricate firing mechanisms. More importantly, the armies now had an insatiable appetite for gunpowder, a mixture of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur. This created a vast new supply chain, with nations competing for control of the resources needed to produce it. The organization of labor shifted accordingly. Armies now needed engineers and specialists in far greater numbers, men who understood the chemistry of powder and the mechanics of firearms. This system demanded a new kind of soldier. The individual skill of a knight or the reckless courage of a swordsman became less important than unwavering discipline. Soldiers had to be drilled relentlessly until the complex sequence of loading a musket became second nature, something their bodies could do without thinking, even as men fell around them. They had to learn to march in tight formation, to wheel and turn as a single entity, and to trust implicitly in the men standing beside them. The pikeman trusted the musketeer to weaken the enemy, and the musketeer trusted the pikeman to hold the line and give him the time he needed to reload. This interdependence forged a powerful bond, turning formations into communities of survival. Of course, not everyone adopted the exact same solution. Period documents, particularly the illustrated drill manuals that became common in the 17th century, show fascinating regional variations. The Spanish tercio was a massive, deep formation, sometimes containing 3,000 men. It was incredibly resilient and powerful in defense, but was also slow and difficult to maneuver. In the Netherlands, commanders like Maurice of Nassau, fighting for independence from Spain, developed a different approach. He favored smaller, more rectangular units that were less dense but far more flexible on the battlefield. This allowed him to move his troops more quickly and bring a greater percentage of his musketeers to bear at any one time.
This difference in doctrine highlights an ongoing discussion among historians about the evolution of these tactics. Was the dense, powerful tercio the peak of pike and shot formations, or was its inflexibility a fatal flaw? The answer seems to be that it depended on the situation. On an open field against a frontal assault, the tercio was nearly unbeatable. But in a war of maneuver, or on broken ground, the shallower and more mobile Dutch formations often held the advantage. This tactical conversation, carried out on the battlefields of Europe, would drive military innovation for over a century. The experience of a soldier within such a formation was one of sensory overload and intense focus. The constant shuffling of feet on soil, the jingle of equipment, and the low murmur of hundreds of anxious men were the background sounds. The world was often reduced to the few feet around him. The back of the man in front, the shaft of the pike held by the man beside him, the sergeant's voice cutting through the noise. When the muskets fired, the sound was a physical blow, a harsh crack that left ears ringing. The smoke would then roll back, stinging the eyes and cloaking the enemy in a shifting, ghostly shroud, from which a counterattack could emerge at any moment. A curious detail from accounts of the era concerns the match cord itself. This simple piece of treated rope was a soldier's lifeline, the source of his weapon's fire. It had to be kept lit for hours, smoldering in all kinds of weather. Soldiers would often hold the burning end in their mouths or tucked inside their hats to protect it from rain. But it was also a constant danger. A stray spark from a neighbor's match could ignite the powder in a man's own flask, leading to a catastrophic accident.
It was a small, persistent threat that added another layer of tension to the already stressful environment of the battlefield.
Ultimately, the pike and shot system represented a battlefield in balance. It was an equilibrium between an ancient weapon, the spear, and a new one, the gun. The pike provided the defensive strength that the slow-firing musket lacked, while the musket provided the ranged killing power that could break up enemy formations before they ever reached the line of spears. This combination dominated European warfare for nearly 200 years, a testament to its effectiveness. It created armies that were more professional, more disciplined, and more lethal than any that had come before. This profound transformation of the battlefield from a place of individual charges to one of coordinated, drilled formations laid the groundwork for the standing armies of the modern era. The principles of mutual support, disciplined volley fire, and the integration of different weapon systems were refined and developed over generations. These developments in tactical systems offer a compelling view into the methodical and systematic nature of military evolution, where new technologies constantly pose questions that human ingenuity must answer. The preceding era had forged armies into dense blocks of men, hedgehogs of pike and shot, slow-moving and powerful. But as the 17th century gave way to the 18th, a new kind of order began to impose itself upon the fields of Europe. On a wide, flat plain under a cool gray sky, the landscape itself seems to have been redrawn with a ruler. Long, impossibly thin lines of men, sometimes only 3 ranks deep, stretch from one horizon to the other. Their coats are not the drab colors of camouflage, but brilliant reds, blues, and whites. These bright uniforms are not for parade. They are a grim necessity for commanders attempting to distinguish friend from foe through the thick, sulphurous clouds that will soon cover the ground. For a soldier in this line, the world shrinks to the man in front of him and the men to his left and right. There is no individual action here, only the collective, disciplined whole.
This transformation was driven by 2 key pieces of technology that, together, rendered the old way of fighting obsolete. The first was the flintlock musket. For over a century, soldiers had relied on the matchlock, a weapon that used a burning cord to ignite its powder. It was clumsy, slow, and easily defeated by a steady rain. The flintlock, by contrast, used a piece of flint clamped in a small hammer. When the trigger was pulled, the hammer snapped forward, striking a steel plate and creating a shower of sparks that ignited the powder. The mechanism was faster and, most importantly, far more reliable. This newfound dependability meant that a commander could count on hundreds of men firing their weapons at the very same moment. Account books from armories of the period show a massive shift in production, focusing on these standardized, mass-produced weapons, reflecting the need to equip entire armies with identical tools. The second, and perhaps more decisive invention, was the socket bayonet. Previously, a bayonet was a long dagger with a handle that was literally plugged into the musket's barrel, instantly turning the firearm into a short, unwieldy spear.
A soldier could not fire his weapon while his bayonet was fixed. The socket bayonet, a simple but brilliant innovation, featured a metal ring and a bend that allowed the blade to be fixed around the barrel. For the first time, a single soldier could fire his musket and then, in the next instant, use it as a defensive spear, without any modification. This single piece of metal made the pikeman, the soldier who had protected musketeers for 200 years, entirely redundant. Every infantryman was now both a ranged and a close-quarters fighter, a self-sufficient component in a much larger machine. With these tools in hand, a new tactical system emerged, one that demanded a level of discipline previously unimagined. The practice was known as linear tactics. Its deadliest expression was volley fire. The process, detailed in countless drill manuals from the time of military reformers like Prussia's Frederick the Great, was a grim ballet of mechanical precision. Upon a shouted command, the entire front rank of a battalion would raise their muskets as one. At the next command, they would fire in a single deafening crash, a wave of sound that rolled across the field. Immediately, they would begin the complex, multi-step process of reloading, reaching into a cartridge box, biting the paper cartridge open, pouring powder down the barrel, ramming the ball and paper down with a ramrod. It was a sequence of motions drilled into them for thousands of hours on the parade ground until it became automatic, something their bodies did while their minds tried to ignore the chaos around them.
The true genius of the system was what happened next. As the first rank reloaded, the second rank would step forward or fire through the gaps, unleashing its own volley. Then the third rank would do the same. This technique, known as the rolling volley, created a continuous, pulsing wave of fire that an advancing enemy had to endure. It was a system designed to break an opponent's morale long before they reached the line. The labor organization required for this was immense. Armies were no longer temporary levies of citizens. They were permanent, professional bodies of long-serving soldiers. These men were drilled not to be heroes, but to be cogs in a machine. Their individuality was suppressed in favor of collective, robotic efficiency, a quality essential for performing complex drills under the extreme psychological pressure of battle. The human experience inside this machine was unlike anything that had come before. The sheer volume of the coordinated musket fire was overwhelming, a constant roar that left men's ears ringing for days. After the first few volleys, a thick blanket of white smoke from the black powder would settle over the field. It stung the eyes, making them water uncontrollably, and filled the throat with an acrid taste. Soldiers often could not see their targets, firing instead into the dense haze where they knew the enemy line stood, aiming at the flashes of their opponent's muskets. Battle became an impersonal affair. It was not a contest of skill against skill, but of one ordered line against another. The fundamental question was no longer about brilliant charges, but about endurance. Which side's discipline would crack first under the relentless mechanical slaughter? This methodical approach to combat had a profound strategic impact. Warfare became a slower, more deliberate contest of attrition.
Commanders like the Duke of Marlborough in the early 18th century became masters not just of the battlefield, but of the long march and the logistical planning needed to keep these drilled armies in the field. Victory often went to the general who could maneuver his army into a favorable position, and the state that could best afford to train, equip, and pay for these permanent military establishments. The battlefield was becoming less a place of heroic fury and more a chessboard where human pieces, drilled to perfection, were moved according to cold, hard calculation.
The internal world of the soldier had to be completely remade to cope with these new realities. He was trained to stand shoulder to shoulder with his comrades, to load and fire on command, and to hold his ground while men fell around him. His instinct to flee, to seek cover, was beaten out of him on the training ground. He placed his trust not in his own strength, but in the integrity of the line. As long as the line held, he was part of something powerful. If it broke, he was just a man, alone and vulnerable. This created a new kind of courage, not the fiery courage of a charging knight, but the cold, stoic bravery of a man willing to stand and face a storm of lead, trusting that the men beside him would do the same. The development of these highly professional, disciplined armies, capable of performing with such mechanical precision, represents a pivotal moment in the organization of state power. The ability to raise, train, and maintain such forces required a level of administrative and financial organization that earlier societies could not have managed. These armies were the ultimate expression of the centralized state's authority. The evidence drawn from the military reforms and detailed records of 18th century armies continues to inform our understanding of how modern military doctrine and state organization first took shape. The battlefield now leaves the solid earth behind. It is a world governed not by the seasons of the land, but by the shifting moods of wind and water. On the open sea, the dominant sounds are the deep groan of timber under immense strain, and the constant sharp snap of canvas sails high overhead, each one the size of a village square. The deck of a warship, a vessel known as a ship of the line, is never still. It rises and falls with the long, slow breath of the ocean swell, a motion that sailors learn to match in their every step. Before the fight begins, two vast fleets approach one another, moving in long, precise columns that stretch for miles. The sight is one of geometric order imposed upon the chaos of the sea. Then, from the lead ship, a signal flag climbs the mast. On board, the captain gives the order, and along the length of the ship, heavy wooden ports are heaved open, revealing the dark mouths of dozens of cannons. The world holds its breath, waiting for the eruption. This vessel is a fortress made of wood, a masterpiece of engineering designed for a single purpose: to withstand and deliver overwhelming firepower. The technical process of its creation began years earlier in sprawling shipyards. Period documents from naval archives reveal the immense scale of the materials required.
A single large ship of the line consumed over 4,000 mature oak trees, carefully chosen for the natural curves of their trunks and branches to form the ship's resilient frame. The hull was a layered sandwich of these thick oak planks, some over 2 feet thick, intended to absorb the impact of enemy cannonballs. Towering pines, straight and tall, were hauled from distant forests to serve as masts, while acres of flax were grown, harvested, and woven into the canvas for sails, and the miles of rope needed for rigging. This concentration of resources represented a massive national investment, a clear indicator of a nation's ambition. The ship was not merely built, it was a strategic asset, planned and executed with the precision of a grand campaign. The core tactic that defined this era of naval warfare was the line of battle. Historical accounts describe how admirals would painstakingly maneuver their entire fleet into one long, continuous column, sailing parallel to the enemy's line. The reason for this seemingly simple formation was rooted in the design of the ships themselves. The greatest strength of a floating fortress was its broadside, the simultaneous firing of all the cannons on one side of the vessel. By forming a line, each ship could bring its full weight of metal to bear without its view being blocked by a friendly vessel. This method was a stark contrast to earlier naval engagements, which often devolved into messy individual ship-to-ship brawls focused on boarding. The line of battle was a more systematic, impersonal form of combat, a deadly arithmetic of firepower, where victory often went to the fleet that could maintain its discipline and fire its cannons faster and more accurately.
On the command to engage, the orderly scene transforms into a violent, disorienting storm of human effort. Inside the ship, on the gun decks, the space is cramped and dim. Teams of a dozen men work in practiced concert around each massive cannon, a technical process drilled into them for months. One man sponges the barrel to extinguish any lingering embers. Others ram home a cloth bag filled with black powder, followed by a heavy iron ball. The gun captain, squinting through the port, adjusts the aim using heavy levers and wedges. When he is satisfied, he gives the signal. The world erupts in a single deafening boom that physically shakes the 2,000-ton vessel. A thick cloud of sulfurous smoke instantly fills the deck, stinging the eyes and choking the lungs of the crew. They can see little, guided only by their training and the shouted orders of their officers, as they begin the exhausting process of hauling the recoiling cannon back into position to reload. The labor organization aboard such a warship was one of the most complex and hierarchical societies of its time. Hundreds of sailors, marines, and officers lived and worked together in a space no larger than a handful of houses. Surviving naval logs and personal journals paint a vivid picture of this structure. At the top was the captain, an absolute authority, who made the life and death decisions of navigation and combat. Below him were lieutenants who managed the day-to-day running of the ship, and below them a host of specialized roles: the sailing master who understood the winds and currents, the surgeon who dealt with the horrific injuries of battle, and the boatswain whose whistle directed the hard labor of the common sailors. Every man had a specific station and a specific duty, from the young powder monkeys,
boys who ran gunpowder from the magazine to the cannons, to the veteran sailors high in the rigging, trimming the sails in the midst of a fight. It was a system that demanded total obedience and teamwork, for a single mistake could endanger the entire vessel.
Combat at sea was a brutal affair, and the primary danger was not always a direct hit from a cannonball. The most feared consequence of an impact was splintering. When a 32-pound iron ball smashed into the thick oak hull, it did not always pass cleanly through. Instead, it could send thousands of wooden splinters, from tiny shards to dagger-like spears, flying across the gun deck at incredible speed. Surgeons' logs from the period record that more men were killed or maimed by these wooden projectiles than by the cannonballs themselves. The air would become a storm of iron and splintered wood, a harsh mix of sounds combining the roar of the guns with the sharp crack of shattering timber and the cries of the wounded. To survive on a gun deck required a particular kind of courage, the ability to perform complex physical tasks while surrounded by chaos and immediate mortal danger. This mastery of naval warfare had a profound historical impact that reached far beyond the immediate results of any single battle. The analysis of trade records and colonial administrative documents shows a direct link between naval power and global influence. The nation that controlled the seas could protect its own merchant ships while disrupting the trade of its enemies. This control allowed nations like Great Britain to build and maintain vast overseas empires, projecting power across the world's oceans, securing sources of raw materials, and opening new markets for their goods. A powerful fleet was both a shield and a sword. It could defend the homeland from invasion and also enforce a nation's will thousands of miles away. It's no great surprise that a popular song of the era, Rule Britannia, boldly declared that Britannia rules the waves. For the sailors, it was a life of hard work and danger. For their nations, it was the key to global dominance. Scholars continue to examine the precise formula for this naval supremacy. Was it superior ship design, as some shipwrights' plans might suggest? Or was it the superior training and seamanship of the crews, a factor often mentioned in the letters of officers like Admiral Nelson? Another perspective focuses on the sheer weight of national resources. Perhaps victory simply belonged to the nation that could afford to build more ships, cast more cannons, and press more men into service than its rivals. The evidence suggests that all these factors were critical. A well-designed ship was of little use without a skilled crew, and even the best crews could be overwhelmed by a numerically superior foe. Naval power was not just a military matter. It was a complete system, an expression of a nation's total industrial, financial, and organizational strength. This intricate dance of technology, disciplined labor, and national strategy transformed the oceans into the primary stage for global conflict. The ability to construct these floating fortresses, to man them with skilled crews who could execute complex tactical maneuvers under fire, and to sustain them across vast distances became the ultimate measure of a nation's power.
These methods of integrating complex machinery with organized human effort established patterns of worldwide influence that would shape the course of history for generations. The journey through the evolution of conflict concludes not on a field of battle, but in a place where battles are won or lost long before the first shot is fired. Within the canvas walls of a command tent, the only sounds are the soft hiss of a lantern, the rustle of heavy paper, and the low, thoughtful murmur of staff officers. A great map, a tapestry of rivers, roads, and forests, covers a large campaign table. On its surface, small wooden blocks represent tens of thousands of men, each one a life, a family, and a component in a vast and intricate machine. Here, a commander like John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, or a later leader such as Frederick the Great of Prussia would spend countless hours. His gaze would not be on a single enemy formation, but on the entire landscape of the war, a chessboard of immense scale and consequence.
This brings us to the very heart of the grand campaign, the shift from tactics, which is the art of winning a battle, to strategy and logistics, the science of winning a war. The process began with information. Period documents reveal that a commander's first and most constant need was for accurate intelligence. This was not a passive activity. It required a highly organized system. Light cavalry, the eyes and ears of the army, would be dispatched on wide sweeps to locate the enemy, map terrain features not on any existing chart, and assess the availability of local resources. Their reports, carried by dispatch riders who galloped for days, would be pieced together like a puzzle, allowing the commander to anticipate his opponent's movements and intentions. This methodical gathering of knowledge formed the foundation upon which every major decision was built. Based on this flow of information, the immense challenge of supply had to be solved. An army of the 18th century was a moving city that consumed staggering amounts of food for the men and fodder for the horses every single day. Consequently, a campaign was often dictated not by the enemy's army, but by the location of its own supply depots. Historical accounts indicate that great commanders planned their movements around a pre-established chain of magazines, vast storehouses of grain, salted meat, and ammunition. This required a different kind of labor organization, a corps of quartermasters and engineers whose work was just as vital as that of the infantrymen. They had to negotiate with local merchants, organize wagon trains, and secure the roads, ensuring a constant stream of resources flowed from the homeland to the front. A broken supply line could defeat an army more surely than any battle. With intelligence gathered and supply lines secured, the art of maneuver could begin. The technical process involved moving entire armies across the countryside to gain a positional advantage, aiming to force the enemy to fight on ground of the commander's choosing. This was a delicate and dangerous dance. Moving tens of thousands of men, horses, and cannons required precise timing and discipline. The commander and his staff had to consider the state of the roads, the speed of their artillery trains, and the fatigue of their soldiers. A single miscalculation, a delayed river crossing, or a poorly chosen route could expose a flank to attack or leave the army vulnerable and exhausted. The goal was often to threaten the enemy's own supply lines, forcing them to either retreat or accept battle at a disadvantage.
This entire system depended on a new type of social organization within the military, a professional officer corps trained to think strategically. While the great commander made the ultimate decisions, his thoughts were informed and his plans were executed by a team of aides and subordinate generals. These men were increasingly chosen for their skill and education rather than simply their noble birth. They learned to read maps, calculate marching times, and manage the complex logistics of their formations. The correspondence of figures like Frederick the Great shows a constant emphasis on training and discipline, not just for the common soldier, but for the minds of his officers. This development of a professional military staff was a quiet revolution, creating an institution capable of managing the immense complexity of 18th century warfare. However, even the most brilliant plan was constantly at war with an unseen enemy that military thinkers would later call friction. Friction is the collection of countless small, unpredictable problems that can derail any operation. A sudden downpour could turn roads into impassable mud, delaying a crucial march. Sickness might sweep through a camp, reducing the strength of a regiment. A scout might provide mistaken information, or an order might be misunderstood in the chain of command. A commander often found himself torn between a bold, decisive plan and the more cautious path that accounted for these ever-present risks. He might pace his tent for hours, weighing the potential for a glorious victory against the possibility of a disastrous failure caused by something as simple as a broken wagon wheel. The decision of when and where to seek a decisive battle was therefore the most difficult calculation of all. A commander had to integrate every element under his control into one coherent action. He had to consider if his infantry, drilled in the precise volley fire of linear tactics, had enough ammunition for a prolonged engagement. He had to know if his cavalry was fresh enough to deliver a powerful charge or pursue a broken enemy. He had to ensure his heavy artillery was in a position to support the main attack. All of these factors, from the health of his men to the number of cannonballs in his supply train, had to be weighed. The final choice to commit his army was the culmination of weeks or even months of careful planning and maneuvering.
This methodical, almost scientific approach to warfare represented the synthesis of all the developments that had come before. The discipline of the Roman legion, the shock of the knightly charge, the killing power of the longbow and the musket. All of these tactical elements were now pieces in a much larger strategic game. The focus expanded from the individual soldier's skill to the organizational genius required to keep that soldier fed, armed, and in the right place at the right time. The military writings from the era reveal a growing understanding that wars were won not just by courage, but by careful administration and intellectual rigor. In the quiet of the campaign tent, under the flickering lamplight, the commander would finally make his choice. A finger would trace a line on the map, a quiet instruction would be given to an aide, and a set of orders would be drafted and sent out by dispatch riders. That single, calm action would set thousands into motion, leading them toward a field that would decide the fate of nations.
It was the final expression of a long and complex process, a testament to the human mind's capacity to impose order on the chaos of war. Such a systematic approach to planning and logistics signaled a deep transformation in the conduct of organized human conflict. This intellectual structuring of warfare would continue to evolve, laying the groundwork for how campaigns would be managed for centuries to come, creating a direct line from the candlelit maps of the 18th century to the command centers of the modern age. As our journey through the great battles before 1800 comes to a close for tonight, let's leave the field behind. Consider the quiet that followed the thunder of cavalry and the clash of steel. The intricate military tactics we discussed, the disciplined phalanx, the clever pincer movement, all eventually gave way to stillness. After the strategies were executed and the maps were folded, there was only the quiet camp and the deep weariness of the soldiers, a hard-won peace under a silent sky.
Let that same sense of finality settle over you now. The campaigns of your day are complete. The complex maneuvers of your thoughts can be set aside. Allow the ordered lines of history to soften into the gentle landscape of your dreams. There are no more formations to hold, no more ground to take. There is only rest. Sleep peacefully and dream well.